A folded envelope. A sheriff who wouldn't meet his eyes. 60 days to leave the workshop on Park Street that his father had slept in, built by a company that owned half of Butte and every judge in it. Reginald didn't hire a lawyer. He didn't pack his things. He went outside in the February cold and started building something nobody understood yet. And when the Anaconda finally sent a man to collect what they thought was already theirs, they found 11 people standing in the snow waiting for a furnace that changed every calculation they had. What would you have done in his place? If this story got you, leave a like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Sheriff Dolan came on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail Reginald would remember for the rest of his life. Not because Tuesdays meant anything in particular, but because he had been in the middle of repairing a wagon axle for a man named Petrick, who needed it back before Thursday, and the interruption felt so small and ordinary that it took him a moment to understand what was actually happening. Dolan knocked twice on the open door of the workshop, held out a brown envelope sealed with wax, and when Reginald reached for it, the sheriff had already turned halfway around, his eyes finding something very interesting in the middle distance down Park Street. Not the ground, not Reginald's face, just somewhere else. Reginald stood in the doorway with grease on his left hand and the envelope in his right, watching Dolan walk back toward his horse without once looking back, and understood that whatever was inside that envelope was the kind of thing decent men preferred not to witness being opened. He broke the seal slowly, the way you open something when part of you already knows the contents. The document inside was 4 pages long and used the word requisition 7 times. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company required the property at his address for expansion of a materials depot on the eastern corridor of Montana Street. He had 60 days to vacate. There was a compensation figure at the bottom of the 3rd page, and it was the number that finally made him sit down on the wooden step outside his own door. He walked to Broadwater Avenue that afternoon, while the light was still good, because he didn't want to arrive at a lawyer's office looking like a man who had already given up. Harlan Price had a small office above a dry goods store, and he was the kind of lawyer who kept his desk clean and his promises modest, which in Butte meant he was probably the most honest man in his profession. Price read the document twice, and Reginald watched him the way you watch a doctor reading a test result, studying the small movements around the eyes. Price set the papers down and took off his glasses and placed them on the desk with both hands, which told Reginald everything before a single word was spoken. Price said that the Anaconda had acquired expansion rights in an agreement with the City Council in 1889, that the agreement had been approved by the same council that currently employed 2 of the Anaconda's former contractors, and that the compensation figure on page 3, while insulting, was technically within legal bounds. He said he was sorry. He said it like he meant it, which somehow made it worse. Reginald folded the document back into the envelope, thanked Price for his time, counted the coins for the consultation fee, and walked out onto Broadwater Avenue into the cold that had been sitting over Butte for 11 days straight without breaking. He didn't go home immediately. He walked instead, pulling his coat closed, moving through the familiar grid of streets without any particular direction. He passed the entrance to the Never Sweat mine on the north end, where a shift change was happening, men going down and men coming up in a slow rotation that had been running without pause for years. He passed the offices of the Butte Miner on Granite Street, their lamplight already burning in the late afternoon. He stopped for a moment in front of a hardware supplier on Wyoming Street, where he had bought most of his tools over the years, staring at the display in the window without really seeing it. He was doing arithmetic in his head, the way his father had taught him, which was to list what you have before deciding what you need. He had the workshop itself and everything in it. He had 16 years of reputation on Park Street. He had a son who was 22 and getting restless. He had the skills his hands carried. And then there was the thing his father had passed on. The thing that wasn't written anywhere, because the men who developed it had never been allowed the luxury of writing things down. He started walking again, faster this time, with somewhere to go. Clement was at the kitchen table when Reginald got home, and there was a folded map open in front of him, the kind sold at the post office on Hamilton Street, covering Colorado and the territories south. Denver was circled in pencil, lightly, as if Clement had been going back and forth about whether to make the mark. He didn't close the map when his father came in. He didn't explain it either. He just looked up, read something in Reginald's face, and looked back down at the map. They ate supper without discussing the envelope. Reginald told Clement the axle for Petrick still needed finishing and asked if he could start on it in the morning. Clement said yes. They talked about whether the cold was going to hold through the week and whether the cost of coal had gone up again at Hennessy's on the corner. They did not talk about Broadwater Avenue or Harlan Price or the number on page 3. At some point during the meal, Clement said, almost carefully, that a man he knew had found work in Denver at a manufacturing outfit. Good work, steady. Reginald said that was good for him. Clement nodded and said nothing else. After supper, Clement went to his room, and Reginald sat at the table alone for a while with his coffee going cold, looking at the map that his son had left behind without folding it. He went to the workshop around 9, not because there was anything urgent to do, but because it was where he thought most clearly. His father had spent the last 4 months of his life sleeping on a folding cot in the back corner of that room near the small stove, and even years later Reginald sometimes caught himself glancing at that corner when something was weighing on him, the way you look toward a chair where someone used to sit. He lit the lamp on the workbench and found a receipt from last month's coal delivery, blank on the back, and sat down on the stool with a piece of charcoal. He started with what he remembered. His father had described the geometry once, late at night in Georgia before they came west, using a stick to draw in the dirt floor of their quarters. The principle was about the shape of the chamber, the angle of the air intake, the position of the fire relative to the material being worked. You could achieve the same heat with considerably less fuel if the chamber was built correctly, because you were using the heat that the fire produced instead of letting it escape. The large furnaces of the Anaconda didn't need this knowledge because they had unlimited coal. A man working with what he had needed it desperately. Reginald drew the angles, corrected them, drew them again. He noted the dimensions on the side of the receipt in small, careful numbers. Outside, a cart went by on Park Street, and the lamp flame shifted slightly. He didn't look up. He worked on the drawings until sometime past 2 in the morning, and when he finally set the charcoal down, the back of the receipt was covered in calculations, and the front was smudged with fingerprints. He folded it once and put it in the breast pocket of his work shirt, against his chest, where he kept things he didn't want to lose. He turned off the lamp, stood in the dark for a moment, and looked at the empty lot through the small window on the north wall. It was a piece of ground that appeared in no Anaconda document, that belonged to nobody who had ever come forward to claim it, that had been sitting frozen and useless beside his workshop for as long as he had been on Park Street. He had walked past it thousands of times without thinking about it as anything other than empty space. He was thinking about it differently now. He was 60 days from losing the ground under his feet, and somewhere in those 60 days, on that cold and unclaimed lot, he intended to build something that nobody in Butte was going to see coming. The first week, Reginald worked without telling anyone what he was building. He would close the shop at 6, eat whatever Clement had left on the stove, and then go back outside to the lot with 2 kerosene lanterns and the folded receipt in his shirt pocket. He had bought materials carefully and quietly, spreading purchases across different suppliers so no single order looked like anything significant. 40 pounds of fire brick from a mason on Arizona Street, a bag of refractory clay from a builder's yard near the train depot on Front Street, iron rods and flat stone he already had in the workshop. He carried everything himself, load by load, because hiring help meant answering questions he wasn't ready to answer. The structure he was raising was low and compact, nothing that would catch the eye from the street in daylight. But at night, the lanterns threw long shadows across the lot, and the sound of his work carried. He knew men could hear him. He knew some of them stopped to look. He kept his head down and his hands moving, because the moment you stop to explain yourself to people who have already decided what they think, you have lost time you cannot get back. The laughing started in the second week. A group of men from the Never Sweat night shift passed the lot around midnight on a Wednesday, and one of them, a stocky Irishman named Cormac, who worked the lower shaft, stopped and watched Reginald for a moment before calling out. He asked if Reginald was building himself a tomb. Another man behind him said something in Gaelic that made the group laugh harder. Reginald looked up, made eye contact with Cormac, and said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, but because the answer was going to be visible soon enough, and words would only cheapen it. Cormac shrugged, and they kept walking, their laughter fading as they turned onto Park Street. Reginald went back to laying the inner course of brick, pressing each piece into the clay bed with both hands, checking the angle against a wooden guide he had made from a scrap board. His knees ached from crouching in the cold, and his fingers were going numb inside his gloves. But the chamber was taking shape exactly as the drawings said it should, and that was the only thing that mattered at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, in February, in Butte. The Butte Miner ran the note on a Friday. It was 3 lines, at the bottom of page 6, between an advertisement for Hennessy's Mercantile and a notice about a missing mule. The columnist, a man named Aldous Webb, who wrote a weekly piece called Street Level, and who Reginald had never spoken to in his life, described a colored blacksmith on Park Street who appeared to be constructing a personal monument in a vacant lot, possibly as a response to his impending eviction by the Anaconda Copper Mining Company. Webb wrote that the project had become a source of quiet amusement for night shift workers in the area, and ended the note with the observation that it was, at least, a more dignified response than most. Clement read the piece at breakfast without saying a word, then folded the newspaper and placed it face down next to his coffee cup, pressing it flat with one hand as if he were trying to keep something from getting out. He ate the rest of his meal looking at the table. Reginald read the note standing up, finished his coffee, set his cup in the basin, and went to the workshop to start the day. He did not mention the article, neither did Clement. But that evening, when Reginald went out to the lot, the receipt with the drawings was still in his shirt pocket, and he worked 2 hours longer than he had the night before. Branko Vukovic appeared on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week, during business hours, which meant he came through the front door of the workshop like a customer. He was a broad man in his late 30s, with a beard that had grown past the point of intention and a knee wrapped in the kind of rough bandage that a man applies himself because he cannot afford a doctor on Copper Street. He carried a sack over his shoulder that he set on the floor near the door without being asked, and he stood for a moment looking around the workshop with the careful, professional attention of someone who understood what he was looking at. He said his name, said he worked the Never Sweat until 3 weeks ago when his knee decided otherwise, and then said he had heard something from a man who had heard something from another man, which was how every important piece of information traveled in Butte. He said he had raw copper in the sack. He said the Anaconda was offering him 11 cents per pound for it, which was the price they set, and the only price available, and that he had 42 pounds, which meant he was looking at less than $5 for material he had carried out of the earth with his own body. He asked if the thing Reginald was building on the lot was what he'd heard it was. Reginald looked at the sack, looked at Branko, and told him to come back at 6. They tested the furnace for nearly 4 hours that evening, and the process was not clean or easy or immediately impressive. The first run produced copper that was acceptable, but not remarkable, and Reginald spent 40 minutes adjusting the air intake and repositioning the buffer stone before the second attempt. Branko sat on an overturned crate and watched without interrupting, which Reginald appreciated more than he could have explained. Most men, when they are waiting for something they need, fill the silence with questions or suggestions or nervous talk. Branko just watched, occasionally handing a tool when it was clear one was needed, the way men who have worked in tight spaces with other men learn to read a situation. On the third run, the temperature in the chamber climbed past the point where it should have been capable of going with that amount of fuel, and the copper that came out was a different thing entirely. It was clean and consistent in a way that the first 2 runs had not been, and Reginald could tell by the color and the way it moved in the mold that the geometry was doing exactly what his father's instructions had said it would do. He stood looking at it for a moment. Branko stood next to him and said a word in Croatian, quietly, almost to himself. Reginald didn't know the word. He knew exactly what it meant. Branko left around 10, carrying the processed copper wrapped in cloth and tucked under his arm, walking carefully on his wrapped knee toward the boarding house on Galena Street, where he rented a room with 5 other men. Reginald cleaned the tools and banked the fire in the furnace, making small notes on a new scrap of paper about what had worked in the final run and what still needed adjustment. He was inside the workshop, at the bench, when he heard Clement come in through the back door. Clement stood near the entrance for a moment without speaking, looking at his father bent over the workbench in the lamplight. Then he said, "Was that Branko Vukovic?" Reginald said it was. Clement nodded slowly, and said he had worked the same shaft as Branko for 2 years before Branko's knee gave out. He said Branko was not the kind of man who talked much, but when he did, people listened. Reginald looked up from his notes and held his son's gaze for a moment, and something passed between them that neither one put into words. Clement said good night and went upstairs. Reginald turned back to his notes and wrote down the chamber dimensions one more time, precisely in the margins of the page. The next morning, before he had lit the forge or unlocked the front door, 3 men were already standing outside the workshop on Park Street, waiting. Arthur Finch arrived at 10:30 on the 59th day, which told Reginald something useful before the man had opened his mouth. A company representative who arrives on the last possible day, in the middle of the morning, with 2 assistants carrying a leather document case, is not a man who expects complications. He is a man who expects to hand over a paper, watch it get signed, and be back in his office on Montana Street before lunch. Finch was somewhere in his 40s, well-dressed in a gray wool overcoat that had been bought somewhere better than anything available in Butte, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had done this kind of work many times and found it unremarkable. He came around the corner from Park Street and stopped. The line had formed early, before 8, and by the time Finch arrived, it had grown to 11 men standing in the snow with their material between their feet or over their shoulders, waiting their turn with the patience of people who had spent their working lives waiting for a shift whistle. There was Branko near the front, his knee still wrapped but holding better than it had a month ago. There was Istvan, the Hungarian tinsmith from Wyoming Street, who had needed Branko to translate the first 3 times he came, but now managed well enough on his own. There were ex-miners, a furniture maker, 2 men Reginald only knew by face. Finch looked at the line, then at the furnace on the lot, then at Reginald, who was standing at the front of it all with his apron on and his arms at his sides. Finch recovered quickly, which meant he was good at his job. He introduced himself by name and company, which was unnecessary since everyone on Park Street already knew who he worked for, and asked if Reginald was the property holder. Reginald said he was. Finch opened the document case and produced a 4-page transfer agreement, the same type of document that had arrived with Sheriff Dolan 60 days earlier, and explained that the terms were unchanged from the original notice, that the compensation figure remained as stated, and that execution of the transfer required only a signature, and the property would be clear of obligation by the end of the following week. He spoke evenly and without any particular coldness, the way a man speaks when he is not personally invested in the outcome. Reginald listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said calmly that the workshop and the lot where the workshop stood were covered by the original notice. He pointed to the adjacent lot, the unclaimed land where the furnace sat. He said that lot was not included in any document the Anaconda had filed with the city, a fact that Harlan Price had confirmed for him 6 weeks ago at no charge, because Price said it was the least he could do. Finch looked at the furnace. He looked at the line of men. He looked back at the document in his hand, as if checking whether he had missed something. The question Finch asked next was the one that mattered. He asked it quietly, almost carefully, stepping slightly to the side so the 2 assistants were not directly behind him when he spoke. He asked how much copper the furnace processed per day. It was not a legal question. It was not a procedural question. It was the question of a man who had just understood that he was looking at something his superiors had not accounted for, and who needed a number before he could decide what to do with that understanding. Reginald told him he said it plainly, without emphasis, the way you state a fact that does not require decoration. He said that on a full day, with 3 or 4 men working in rotation, the furnace could process between 80 and 100 pounds of raw copper and return a refined product that graded significantly higher than what the Anaconda's own purchasing agents were accepting at the company store on Broadway. Finch was quiet for a moment. One of the assistants started to write something down, and Finch put a hand briefly on the man's arm without looking at him, and the assistant stopped. Finch asked if the furnace design was Reginald's own. Reginald said it was his family's. Finch nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they are not agreeing, but acknowledging. And then he folded the transfer document and placed it inside his coat pocket. He left without signing anything and without explaining why, which was the most interesting thing he did all morning. The 2 assistants followed him back around the corner onto Park Street, and within 30 seconds it was as if they had never been there at all, except that every man in the line had watched the whole exchange, and the mood in the line was different afterward. Nobody cheered or made a show of it. Branko caught Reginald's eye and gave a small nod. Istvan said something in Hungarian under his breath that sounded satisfied. The line kept moving because the furnace was still going, and the men who were waiting had come a long way in the cold with their material and were not leaving without using it. Reginald went back to work. He helped Istvan position a new batch, checked the air intake, made a small adjustment to the buffer stone that he had been meaning to make for 2 days. He did not allow himself to think too far ahead, because Finch leaving without signing was not a victory yet. It was a pause. The Anaconda did not pause without a reason, and understanding their reason was going to matter more than celebrating the moment. But he let himself feel the morning for what it was, standing at the furnace with his hands warm from the work, on land that was still his. The last man in line left around 4 in the afternoon, and Reginald spent an hour afterward doing the maintenance work on the furnace that he couldn't do while it was running, clearing the ash bed and checking the inner brick for any cracking from the repeated heating cycles. Clement came out around 5 and helped without being asked, the way he had started doing over the past few weeks, quietly taking the other end of a task when he could see one needed doing. They worked side by side without talking much, and when the furnace had cooled enough to bank for the night, they sat down on the low stone wall at the edge of the lot. The cold had come back hard after the afternoon, and their breath was visible. Clement said, after a while, that he had watched Finch from the workshop window. He said the man had stood on the sidewalk for almost 2 full minutes before he approached, which Clement had timed against the clock on the workshop wall. He said it looked like a man who had arrived expecting one thing and found another. Reginald said that was exactly what had happened. Clement was quiet for a moment, and then said he had taken the map of Denver off the kitchen table 3 weeks ago and put it in the bottom drawer of his dresser. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. Reginald reached into the breast pocket of his work shirt and took out the folded receipt that had been there since the first night, the one with the calculations on the back. It was soft at the folds now from being handled so many times, and one corner had torn slightly and been folded back on itself. He held it out to Clement without saying anything. Clement took it and opened it carefully, reading the numbers and angles in the lamplight that came through the workshop window. He turned it over to look at the printed side, the coal delivery receipt from last November, and then turned it back to the calculations again, working through the geometry the way Reginald had seen him work through problems since he was a boy, with his lips pressed together and his eyes moving slowly. He found the name in the lower corner after a moment. Joseph. It was written in smaller letters than everything else on the page, as if it had been added after the work was finished, not as part of the calculation, but as something else entirely. A credit. An acknowledgement written in the dark of the workshop on the first night, when the decision had not yet been made, but the direction had become clear. Clement sat with the paper in his hands for a long time, and the furnace ticked quietly beside them as it cooled, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. What did you think of Reginald building that furnace while everyone in Butte was laughing at him? Leave your answer in the comments, and on a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.